Before we get into today's episode with Martina, classmates, I'd like to begin with some housekeeping. We didn't have a lot of time to unpack some of the concepts and the regulations that Martina brings up during our conversation, so don't be put off by any technical language because there are some important philosophical points in there. However, before we get going, I wanted to lay out a few of my own thoughts here because I'm only partially able to express them during the interview, and I'd like to outline a few of the conversation points that we spoke about post-interview that's instructive to how we think about these issues. You'll hear towards the end of the conversation that Martina believes that more experts will deliver a more sustainable society and business environment, and I disagree with that, as you'll hear. To unpack those reasons a little bit, the reason why I disagree is that ultimately I believe there is a conflict of visions between those in the thinking class who are driving the regulatory and policy agenda and those that are impacted by it. So before we get into definitions of what those visions might be, I'm a member of the thinking class, and those who are a part of this class, we tend to look to other experts to guide our work. We talk in acronyms, we're pretty fond of forecasts and models and white papers, and we champion regulatory measures that support our policy goals, whilst looking to non-governmental organisations and industry forums to legitimate what we do. So what is this conflict of visions that I'm talking about? Roger Scruton, the late English philosopher, called people like us unscrupulous optimists, while Thomas Sowell, the famous American economist, said that we possess the vision of the anointed and see ourselves as particularly enlightened and with an innate ability to formulate solutions and plans for global or societal problems. I'm going to mash up Sowell and Scruton's concepts and refer to us as blind visionaries because we know what world we want to see, yet we can be blind to so much of it. We want to improve the world, and we possess an boundless optimism in both our abilities and the likelihood of our plans and solutions to work out. I don't know where Martina stands on any of this. However, I do know that she's a tireless worker. She's really well respected in her profession and a positive presence, as you'll hear on the show. So let's unpack some of my views on our conversation and on our correspondence after the conversation. So following our call, we spoke about the farmers' protests across Europe. These are specifically taking place in response to sustainability regulation that has been introduced by the European Union. This is not exactly the same as environmental social governance, but there are links and overlaps. Both of us agreed that those making the rules have no understanding of what it takes to do, only to think and to make rules. And this is what leads to the disconnect. And there are some quite strident voices, Martina is not one of them, that seems to lazily dismiss any dissent against such regulation as right-wing people polarizing the issue. I find this strange when you'll find left-wing commentators like Yanis Varoufakis heavily criticizing the EU and its regulatory agenda. So this is why I offered in further correspondence with Martina online that I have no faith that the thinking class will change its ways. Martina agreed, although I may be not sure for what reasons. They might be the same as mine, they may not be. As I said, I haven't run this past Martina, and so I don't know where she stands. However, I have noticed a change since the farmers' protests in those of us responsible for such policy and regulation that are starting to suggest that we should somehow include people like farmers and those impacted into the big bureaucratic decision-making processes in an attempt to fix this disconnect. This would, of course, be a start. However, I'm not confident it will work. And the reason why is because of that conflict of visions that I was talking about. If that's one reason, the other reason being the ability of technocrats to set up democratic processes to account for the realities on the ground. I'd be happily proven wrong, of course, and it's positive that there seems to have been a sea change in thought amongst those who might have some influence on such processes. Finally, Martina believes that ESG and sustainability have a transformative power and can be used to positive ends. I certainly don't doubt its transformative power. However, in my view, it is this transformational mindset and its implications that people are bridling against. I think many of those people who are revolting against these things actually take a different view, which is that they don't want an expert class that constantly moves the goalposts, nor do they want to look at other parts of the world do much better than them and without the same regulatory burden, but may cause a higher impact environmentally than what they do. And nor do they want to be sacrificed to global markets, which is what will happen when farms close down and food imports are relied upon. There are other aspects to this as well, particularly on the social side of things, which you'll hear in the conversation. However, our obsessions with solutions in the thinking class run counter to the vision of those who actually work close to the land or work with their hands, and they possess what Sol would call the constrained vision or the tragic vision. They believe that compromise is essential because there are no ideal solutions, there are only trade-offs. And people with this vision understand the imperfectibility of human nature, that we don't know it all, and they know that we are tempted by power. And generally, people with this vision would prefer systematic processes like the rule of law or to rely on the experience of tradition. So there's an unscrupulous optimism among the planners, but we need to recognize there are uses of pessimism. I felt when I first became aware of ESG and sustainability policy that it felt like globalization and its effects were being smuggled through the back door. And this, in my view, is why it won't ever really be accepted by those who are impacted by it, because they understand the trade-offs and the consequences better than any planning committee or bureaucratic organization sitting in a cosmopolitan city far away from wherever food is being produced or whatever else it is that we're talking about. And they don't want to be sacrificed to any grand plans or markets, no matter how well-intentioned. But this is the nature of technocratic rule. Proponents believe a group of technical experts can govern society with science, technology, and metrics and targets, which blind people to civilizational and political risk and can cause a great deal of emotional and financial distress in the real world. I'm not sure if it's possible to cultivate the tragic vision amongst our policymakers and politicians, but from where I'm standing, these people could do with trying it. Enjoy the show, classmates. Martina, welcome to Thinking Class. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, John.
Yeah, very good to meet you too, after all of my inadequacies with arranging technical matters, such as sending a successful invite. But your enduring patience has been very well received. We were introduced to each other by Dr. Catherine Gilden-Lemaire, who featured in a previous episode of Thinking Class. And we got into the topic of theology and why we think there's a place for it in business. And she thought, you know what? You and Martina would be able to have a good discussion about a part of the business world which has really come into vogue, I would say, since the beginning of the pandemic, 2020. It predated that long before, but that was when it really rose to prominence. And it's the three letters which anyone who's spent any time in the corporate world would have heard of, but most people may not have outside of it: ESG, environmental social governance. And you were into it long before it became fashionable. I think we should unpack it for the listeners and talk about what it is and how you found yourself in the field.
Great pleasure, John. Yes, indeed. I think what is becoming increasingly apparent, that ESG is not a fad. It probably has a key place in mainstream finance. It definitely has found its place in regulation. And maybe that's also why it receives increasingly, at least at the moment, and there are also political and polarized political motivations, a bit of a backlash again. But it's the next level of what I call not the paradigm shift, but the full circle, like an equity circle, which ultimately happens as a downward trend every 7 to 8 years. And I've been at least through it twice. So delighted to be on this call today. I've been in ESG, formerly socially responsible and ethical investing, which has close links to ESG, as well as then sustainable investing, actually being on the so-called buy side in investment management, as well as on the sell side in obviously on the side with the service providers providing ESG data, ratings, even derived data products such as indices. I've been through these cycles a few times over the last 20 years. And again, we have seen that ESG has moved from the fringes as a socially responsible and an ethical investment trend as highlighted towards mainstream sustainable investing, again, also with new thematic and impact investment connotations. And it has moved from active investment strategies towards passive, another major trend. Leading ETFs have been launched, or exchange traded products and funds have been launched, index linked funds have been launched in the last decade or so. And we are now talking about $46 trillion in assets in this space. So no longer an area that can be seen as fringe investing, that can be overlooked. But as I highlighted, given the strong focus on ESG as a marketing term, as a product marketing term, we have seen a lot of backlash, especially since more in the last 3 to 5 years, regulatory efforts, especially here driven by the EU, have reined in, and rightly so. Again, we need probably the right level, the right balance between principles-based and rules-based approaches, so to say, also in order to build the relevant products that provide clarity, consistency, and comparability for this market. But it's interesting for me to see, talking to you right now, versus if I would have talked to you maybe 3 years ago, of how much scrutiny ESG is enduring once and all over again. And we should ask ourselves the question, why? And if and where we have fundamentally maybe changed and moved away from what was historically socially responsible, purpose-led, impact-led investing, and ethical and ethically led investing, to maybe a factor-based approach when and where we just add ESG to the mix to drive short-term performance. And that's definitely what ESG is not.
Okay, I think we should get into elements of the pushback that is happening against ESG. Before we get there, you mentioned $46 trillion of assets under management in this space. BlackRock were often seen as the driver, the popularizer, I suppose, in the asset management industry of ESG. Larry Fink, the CEO, would typically write 2 letters every year, one to investors and another to stakeholders. People talk about stakeholder capitalism, and that's very closely linked to ESG. It's basically saying, let's not think only about financial matters, but think about everyone that might be impacted in the broad scheme of things and all the voices that might be interested. And so Larry Fink would say, look, this isn't just about making money. Here's all of the things that we want to do as a responsible business. He stopped writing those letters last year, and there seemed to be some big outflows and a much smaller chunk of money being put aside or invested into these ESG-related funds. I suppose the question on that front is you talked about cycles, but is that a portent of things to come? Do we think it becomes a small part of or a part of a business model rather than the original, rather imperial ambitions, I would say, of the initial push of ESG at the beginning of the pandemic, which is no, all the investing should be ESG investing. What do you think? What do you think is to come?
Interesting question, John. Ultimately, Larry Fink's letters started with purpose-led investing and stakeholder capital / long-term value creation mechanisms, and asking about, on the one hand, about the fundamental ways of investing, the fundamental purpose of ways of investing. That was obviously very important and a good thing and is absolutely relevant and back to the basics of when and where we started this journey. But I think given that the market mechanisms themselves have followed more and more on a short-term trajectory, potentially the question is, has ESG as a concept already outlived itself? And maybe it has already itself embedded successfully in the mainstream as another financial / not only an extra financial criteria. And hence maybe there is no need anymore to push for stakeholder capitalism, purpose, and long-termism, even though I would question this, because these are, again, back to basics, the fundamental values that underpin and undermine all of our sustainable investment concepts, or most of them at least. I mean, what has definitely happened, and I touched on this very briefly, and that has probably shook the world of investing, We have had over the last decade or so, a proliferation of many different ESG investment strategies, that utilize quite commonly normative frameworks and standards, may that be for certain mechanisms of disclosure, alignment, and or simply labeling and classifications, which again, in turn, are very much needed to build sustainable investment products across the sphere. But given that now regulation, especially in the EU, has initially looked into diversifying away from just a plain brush green concept into providing underlying fundamentals, metrics, KPIs that would literally determine a sustainable investment concept under SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. We have seen either Article 6, no green, Article 8, light green, and Article 9, dark green, to simplify the matters. We have seen now with SFDR reigning in, and Morningstar reported heavily on this, that we have seen initially downward classifications of these so-called green investment vehicles. And then we have seen even, at least last year, a lesser so attempt to launch green funds, when and where we saw multiple funds being launched by the same providers over the last maybe 3 to 5 years. We have clearly seen less funds being launched in the entire industry. I think I saw figures of 6 funds versus, 55 funds being launched in amongst the same time last year versus the year prior in the European jurisdictions amongst the same constituents of actually investment and fund providers. So hence, you can straight away see, I think regulation has done its bit, but I think regulation at the same time is needed for investor protection, to provide a level of clarity, transparency, or clarity, comparability, and consistency that's needed. What is, of course, the big question mark here, John, is as well, how would that sit amongst the global fund management industry? And being also in the world of products, as well as in academia and research, I clearly see the need to align and to build interoperability, also to not actually set you out of context and competition globally. And maybe in some ways, and that's maybe why SFDR is undergoing consultation and reviews, the current approach is too restrictive, too constrained. There's a trade-off with every mechanism. And maybe that's why we have seen some backlash. Why that backlash is coming, though, out of the US might have, of course, also many other different reasons. We see it has moved towards a very politicized, a very polarized debate. And I think that, again, raises the questions, are we really talking black and white, or are we talking the different shades of green and red here, so to say, and the underpinning, the shades of blue for good governance? These are all interesting movements. And to your last point of the question, where are we heading? Well, we're definitely heading towards more regulation globally. ESG book reported we have seen more than 1,255 new pieces of policy and regulation and over 45 new taxonomies, I think in a time frame which covers 2011 to 2023. So I think that shows you the sheer complexity that we are aiming here to address and to manage. It also shows you the clear need for more interoperability amongst these different frameworks and taxonomies. Otherwise, we are running at risk on the investor side, and we've seen that with the corporations already. We are running at risk of reporting fatigue, of backlash, and ultimately of reclassifications and or of less sustainable investment products that we need in order to build long-term trajectories to address some of the most prevailing climate change related, biodiversity related, but also commonly social and governance issues. And I think that's what ESG has helped us to do, to unravel and to understand these challenges. Unfortunately, though, maybe also in the context, we've briefly touched on this now, that has been perceived as far too complex for many mainstream providers. And maybe, and that's just an idea, but maybe we should have taken some of these areas and pillars of environmental issues, social issues, or governance issues more in isolation to address them more effectively. But that's just a consideration.
Okay, that's a good point. The backlash point you made, where you explained that it's typically come from the US, that it's become politicized. I would add a wrinkle to that and suggest that actually ESG even by its proponents, would have admitted that ESG by its nature was political, insofar as I don't think you can get away from the fact that there are political philosophies embedded within the concept. So on the social front, typically that is geared towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. The equity became equity through the pandemic. So it flipped from what was typically equality to equity, two very different things. And within that, the proponents, particularly of the DEI element, have a worldview which critics would say sees the world in an oppressors and oppressed category, and then categorizes different ethnic groups based on where they sit on that scale as they see it. And what this has meant, and as Vivek Ramaswamy, who running for the Republican candidacy in the US has spoken so much about, is that if people are saying that systemic racism exists, that it ought not to be replaced by another form of systemic racism. Racism is racism, whichever way it cuts. And so I think that's probably why there's been a backlash against the social elements. And on the environmental front, I mean, from a US perspective, big oil and gas producer, they're looking at this going, you know, from a civilizational perspective, China, our big geopolitical rival, has something like 96% of control of 96% of all the components that are needed for an energy transition towards electric vehicles, for example, and renewable energy. If we are to suggest that this is the way forward, we're going to end up making ourselves economically unviable and passing the power into a geopolitical rival. And so I would say that the backlash is an example of a point that Ian McGilchrist, he's a famous philosopher, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, a neurologist, and literary scholar. He talks about there being a coincidentia oppositorum, that everything that is brought into being brings an opposite into being. And I believe that the ESG domain has been a bit of an ideological filter bubble, and it has asserted legitimacy over some points, but has not accepted pushback. And I think it's gotten to the point where it may have caused, because of those blind spots, it's caused the pushback because it's not opened itself up to reform. What do you make of any of those points?
Very interesting points. I mean, one thing you said yourself, we shouldn't also create a plain brushstroke and look at region by region, say they are pro versus, again, con ESG. Again, we're talking about the different shades of green here. Even in the US, if you look at climate risk regulation, you mentioned social and human capital management related or DEI related regulation, we see different facets. And we see, for instance, a federal push for supplier governance around climate risk management versus state-based regulation and potentially pushback. But again, then you see in states run by certain groups a clear commitment towards climate risk management versus in others, you see, of course, the powers of lobbyism, of industry interests, and so on and so forth, taking reign and looking in the geopolitical context, and rightly so, also it means of competition and competitive advantage, exactly as you'd outlined. So again, I think it would be false to say it has achieved generally full backlash, / there's not a one-size-fits-all approach or one policy-size-fits-all approach. We have to really look at this picture in a very multifaceted way. What we definitely have to see, and this is something that comes up in the context of other discussions around carbon credit management, for instance, and voluntary carbon markets concepts, when and where you can find new means and mechanisms for product for trade to actually build infrastructure solutions that can reach much larger audiences and tackle much wider problems, versus focusing, and that's maybe also the big issue with ESG because it's so well diversified, on the smaller chunks of sustainable investment to build long-term trajectories. I think what is making ESG complex is that it tries to address, maybe too quickly and in too many ways, the systemic issues of this world. And again, that's why I said heaven potentially would have made more sense, breaking the challenges and the pillars around ESG up and looking more specifically at certain areas that require prioritization also in maybe a climate risk urgency, biodiversity risk urgency context, but also in a socioeconomic context that requires certain levels of prioritization, and working then with stakeholders, policymakers, regulators up and foremost through means of, again, interoperability and global platforms and global mechanisms and organizations to drive a globally standardized and normalized approach. I think a lot of the backlash we're seeing is still linked to lack of awareness, really now the fear of the complexity, and ultimately maybe also the lack of a general commitment from the wider public and the consumers to focus on these topics in times when we are all as consumers facing enormous constraints, also linked to a lot of the geopolitical issues and backlash that we are seeing around the world. So I think it's not the right time, per se, to push concepts that are not concerning us all, but herein lies the conundrum with ESG. These are concepts that should literally concern us all. I think we just need better representation, up and foremost at policy and regulatory level, potentially, to work with us as consumers, and then also, of course, with industry, to get them better aligned and to get them standardized.
So getting to a point where ESG is able to say it's doing what it says it's doing, so it's contributing to this particular environmental policy, it's contributing to this particular social outcome, that obviously needs lots of data. Anyone who spends any time in the corporate world, the public sector, I would actually just say the modern world, there's a bit of a data obsession. Everyone wants data for everything. And once they get that data, they want data on that data. They want it split down. Why is data considered to be such a panacea for decision makers? And what are the pitfalls of focusing too much on data?
Good questions. Again, leading to a lot of complexity, and that complexity comes from the data and the provision of data, the sources of data, the value chain of the data. Let me help Jan to unravel that a bit. I mean, with ESG, we first of all have a pluralism of sources. You know, there's self-reported information leading to inherent biases, very often size biases. Large organizations just simply tend to report more versus smaller ones, maybe because they have the budgets, the resources in place to do so. Then you have biases of self-reported information when and where in the materiality context, companies would put the emphasis on reporting. You could also see there are two streams of theory here. One is double materiality. The other one is financial materiality. You have two major different camps here that follow in line with what are the externalities that companies are causing and what in turn is that delivering as a sort of impact on the wider economy and vice versa, and others that literally simply look at the company and its externalities and its financial impacts, and hence, look at a one-way stream, but not in turn how that also comes back and what impact there might be on the remaining stakeholders and so on and so forth. So in a very simplified way of explaining these two concepts, I'm moving on quite rapidly. So companies, the source of information, inherent biases, the type of concepts that they are following, leading then to different means and ways of reporting. Plus then beyond the biases, you have the information gaps, because not every company in this world is supporting and reporting on sustainability information. And you have the timeliness and the accuracy of information that's also very often questioned. So here you have got the conundrum with ESG data at source level. It remains opaque, it remains fragmented. And that's again another reason when and where and how the EU came in and introduced regulation. Other jurisdictions around the world have followed to actually ensure we have more clarity, consistency, and comparability of information at source level. If you look at the data value chain, you have a pluralism again of different ESG data and ratings providers, ratings and scores providers, I should say, that add their own layer of information. May they have sourced that information directly from companies and or also from the wider public domain and sources, NGO reports, media releases, you name it. They're creating then their own assessment methodology on these raw data points, and through weightings, scorings, and measurement mechanisms, they derive an ESG rating and or scoring data set that's commonly ending up in derived data products, for instance, in indices. And then from there onwards, right, the ratings as well as the raw data are literally sets are sold to a pluralism again of different type of investors. That's investment managers and asset owners around the world. And many of them these days have their own sustainability concepts and methods to assess information. So they're creating an additional derived level of information, of aggregation of information, and then they report all of this information via SFDR here in Europe back to the asset owner community and the wider public. So here's the challenge. If you compare, and MIT Sloan did a fantastic study on this, the aggregate confusion, and a few derivative studies on this as well. The aggregate confusion in 2019 has compared the leading ESG ratings from different providers and came to the conclusion that only 60% are correlated if you compare a rating from an S&P, say, versus an MSCI. Credit ratings, and that maybe is the misleading example because it's not the same what we are looking at when we are deriving a sustainability performance rating, but nevertheless, credit ratings on average are correlated 99% if you compare S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, for example. And I think that in turn is leading to some of this aggregate confusion now and some of the pushback, as well as some of the demands and calls for action/regulation to get more transparency and consistency again alongside that data value chain. Is it giving us the final answers? One may question this. Is it also giving us the need for more standardization, normalization, harmonization? One might definitely question this. And this is why, again, there's been a bit of pushback on SFDR. And again, the question is, one size does not fit all. Every rating methodology comes with proprietary IP. There's also potentially really a need for this because not every asset manager has the means to assess and build the concepts in-house to assess and to ultimately score an ESG or a set of ESG data points to come back to a rating and or a score that's needed for derived data products. So John, in short, it is a challenging, it's an opaque, it's a complex environment. Navigating that jungle is, I think, one of the key aims, but also the key needs for the future to make ESG from a business standpoint a viable proposition. And I think we need that across, the value chain from corporate sources and reporting to investor sources and reporting. And interestingly, regulation is now reining in as well on the service providers. ESMA, the FCA, SEBI in India, they're all proposing regulations around ESG ratings. MiFID II, the retail directive, goes even further than that. It requires or asks for, not requires, asks for regulation of the entire data management industry. So these are the missing points in the data value chain. Again, will that deliver all the answers? Will that help us with demystifying ESG and build more interest and maybe more confidence back in the markets? I don't know, but we have to make the attempts, I think.
Well, the data value chain you just outlined is clearly very complex, lots of different points in there, and clearly there's much that can be obscured within it, or that we couldn't possibly even verify. You've talked a lot about self-reported data and the biases that are going to exist within that, and obviously that's where a lot of this data ends up being scraped from. I came across an example a couple of years ago that was reported in Bloomberg of a company in Italy, in Tuscany, called Solvay. It was a chemicals company. I can't remember what it was producing, but it was on right next to a long stretch of coastline. And it was a AAA rated company, the very top ESG rated company you could get under the MSCI ratings. And anyway, it was for many years, it had already been under investigation for effluents that it was producing through its production process. This effluent proved to be toxic. There was elements of mercury in there within this lime potash. And you could see it from really high up in the air. I wouldn't say space, I don't want to exaggerate, but the beach was clearly contaminated, as was the water. There were also links to higher rates of cancer in the local population. Even once this had come to light, and once MSCI had investigated, they only dropped it to a 2A rating. So that could still, in some ways, have ended up in some kind of a fund that had proposed that it was focusing on environmental matters. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's, I think, obscured within there, and that's a problem. And I suppose where I think a wider question comes in is generally the human response to technology and data. Is I think we are running a risk, and I think we can see this with the rise of generative AI and everyone rushing onto that bandwagon, where people we fetishize efficiency and off-the-shelf solutions so much that when it comes, we barely question it. And we're probably incapable of questioning it or even interrogating it because we've made them so complex. And so what I'm concerned about is that you have lots more of these companies like those we just talked about in Tuscany that are being given so much more money based on their environmental bona fides, and yet they could be causing ecological damage on a scale that is unimaginable, and yet they get rated environmentally friendly because they might have a transition plan, which is to say they're talking about a world where they don't use carbon as much. But this, to me, is the big issue with how carbon has become the myopic focus within the industry. And I know it's trying to, the industry and generally the corporate world is trying to expand it to other parts of the world. And let's get onto that in a moment. But everything in the world is hitched to everything else. Carbon can't be the sole focus, because we can have a lower carbon world whilst it's still being a terrible one and a progressively worse one. And there are many different ways that can come to pass, like we just talked about. So my question to you, Martina, is what environmental data actually matters?
I can only give you an answer. One size doesn't fit all. And that is probably not sufficient, / also leading us back to the points, why is there so much complexity, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and maybe even our fatigue around ESG and the way we look at the world. What is clear, and this is maybe why so many people, including regulators, have honed down on the climate aspect, is you have the GHG emissions protocol and you have a means to measure. And what matters gets measured and vice versa. This was for a long time the tagline for ESG, at least in the early days, and you're nodding here, we know where we are coming from. And there might be even question this, because that again is in itself probably a part of the current conundrum and the ever-growing conundrum in ESG, because not everything can be measured, at least not easily, frequently, and consistently. But that's why, again, climate has led the way, because many of us as consumers, again, can grasp and see and experience with the temperature rise, globally hottest year on record, right, 23, and so on and so forth, and the records are broken year on year. We as consumers have a tendency to better grasp climate change as an, at least not imminent, but as an experienceable risk. And I think that is maybe something that is also then translating back into when and where policymakers and regulators are moving to develop concepts in turn for managing financial means and sustainable capital flows to address these issues. By no means does it mean that waste management and pollution management, to your points, or biodiversity risks, these are other environmental issues, that they are less so relevant and less so important, but they might be less so reported and they might be less so monitored, and definitely conceptually less so understood and less so quantifiable. And hence, there's been maybe less so of an emphasis on them. You also have more global commitments, starting with UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol dating back to 1997, where climate risk concerns as well as propaganda are being interlinked, and a global promotion campaign and a push for the understanding of these issues are concerned. We have seen only a few of these global campaigns. Look, in the 80s, the ozone layer problems and, the links back to hairsprays and so on and so forth. I even remember this as a kid, and the sort of guidance we received as consumers, again, to look and tackle the issues as consumers, interestingly, but together with industry. And I think that was somehow at least semi-successful. We have seen something like, I think, industry, policy, and obviously society trying to copy other more tangible, even though they are intangible, but tangible risks, because they are more experienced, such again as climate change. And hence, with the Kyoto Protocol followed on by the Paris Agreement, and then the plethora of different frameworks, linking back to ultimately the master spreadsheet, the so-called TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has now become part of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board's efforts to grasp sustainability accounting, or to grasp sustainability efforts in accounting frameworks. We are seeing increasingly that there has been that push towards climate, again, because it's more measurable and quantifiable, and because international conventions and frameworks and promotion around these challenges exist. We have seen a similar, at least attempt now, for nature and biodiversity risk. And being an author of the Biodiversity Handbook in 2022, I have to, of course, make sure that these risks are not being overlooked. But well, again, when and where we're seeing successes with these risks making their way into finance is when and where we are creating the links back to accounting, auditing, and assurance, interestingly. And that's another more recent trend going side by side with regulation. We are trying to make ESG, other potentially also S&G risks more quantifiable through these frameworks and metrics that we are discussing, but also through auditing and assurance mechanisms that are closely linked to accounting mechanisms. And again, maybe that's part of the puzzle here to solve the riddle of how you can create more of a normalized and standardized approach and hence bring back the focus on measuring ESG. Will that bring though back, or I'm not sure we have lost it, but will that bring back the full interest and enthusiasm for ESG in and amongst the investment management industry? I might again question this because, again, a lot of the market mechanisms are, of course, driven by supply and demand and by competition. And currently, unfortunately, under EU rules, I think maybe the current sustainable investment vehicles are seen as not competitive enough. And I think, again, there are so many conundrums here we have to tackle. And again, it's a systemic issue, but a multidimensional systemic issue. We have to unravel really the different parts here as we are doing to look at what are the issues in that piece of the puzzle before we even can put it back together.
Humpty Dumpty is the great puzzle. Good British nursery rhyme there. Very niche joke. The question I'd like to put to you as someone who is clearly very influential in this space, has got a lot of credentials. You do lots of hobnobbing, I'm sure, with people who make policy, whether that's to do with policy that needs to be followed at a national level or on a corporate level, and those people who are putting it into effect within organizations. I've got a few ideas as to what I would bring up, but what would you tell business leaders and policymakers to think about on ESG based on how you see the world today?
Put competence first. I think we have another key transformational journey ahead of us, and that is within the corporations, when and where you have now hired and or are in the process of hiring sustainability experts that can help you to unravel the pieces in the puzzle. But very often we have very systemic organizational hierarchical structures, and we would not make room for not just the topics and place these topics at board level. I think it's also run its own course that way. We have to ensure that we really put our efforts where our slogans are, you know, from commitments or slogans to commitments, commitments to actions. It's very interesting to see who is really putting sustainability and not just the name, but the experts first, and who has hired the climate change scientists, the policy and regulatory governance experts, and potentially the social assessment experts that, again, in that area is so vast, might focus on human capital and DEI or supply chain management topics and oversight, or AI and cyber risk resilience, which is a topic between S&G, of course. And we need to give the reins to the experts in order to really build credible frameworks on the one hand, and to report in a credible fashion in line with regulatory parameters, which is its own area of expertise, quite frankly, but also to build credibility for what we do. I think one major thing is, and that has unfortunately run its own turn or course, as I mentioned, is that ESG has become for a long time in the last decade a marketing exercise. And that's why it's now almost lost its trust, its credibility, its momentum. In order to bring that back, we need to start reviewing fundamentally the way we are setting up organizations around centers of excellence and how we are driving leadership and building a pipeline of leaders around the world, cross-border, in these large-scale organizations, and that includes the investment management industry, and we let them run and lead from the top. And I think that is a transformational change that requires much more than just reviewing ESG, but in turn, it's its own governance challenge in itself.
I would say on the credibility front, that the challenge also comes from, well, I would say a direction that is partly anti the expert class. And why I think that is happening, and I'll give an example, is, the last 4 years, we've seen the rise of the Dutch Farmers' Party, probably helped bring Geert Wilders into power, or presumably into power in the Netherlands and Germany. And I know we're falling into sustainability policy here, but we see Berlin gridlocked with tractors. Effectively, what they're protesting against is policies that have been designed by an expert class, those of us in the thinking classes. We tend to reside in cosmopolitan areas. We live in urban centres, and we think globally, but not so much locally. And I think that's the blind spot. I think if credibility is going to be built, actually, within that expert class, you're never going to get away from it. Every society has them since the beginning of time. But there needs to be some kind of an ethos alignment that helps to bring the concerns of the normal person to bear, that it doesn't try and obscure it, and that there is a more local, civic-minded attitude toward things. Because I think the word conservatism is very dirty in the ESG space. But I'm talking about small c conservatism rather than free market conservatism. And what that means is, the traditional ways of life that have been going on for generations. And things like farmers, when they start hitting the streets, they're not the most obvious protesters. There must be something going on there. In Ireland, it's a similar thing. We've become so focused on meeting targets that have been set in these cosmopolitan centres that we come up with ideas, a country of 5 million people, it could sink into the ocean tomorrow, along with the UK, and make not a lot of difference to the output of carbon emissions. Because policy is being made purely around things like carbon emissions or nitrogen emissions, it leads to decisions like, let's get rid of 200,000 cows. It's going to cost us 600 million euros over the next 3 years. And then what's the plan? Well, are we going to rely on global supply chains? Are we going to rely on processed food? There's social issues going on there, right? Firstly, an economic thing. Secondly, probably a health thing. And I think we need to bring those practical consequences back. Things like seeing all green projects as, well, we've invested in renewable energy, therefore that equals good corporate citizenship. When I was interviewing a journalist a few weeks ago who lives in Spain, and Spain is being covered in solar panels. That's a big tick to lots of people who want to decarbonize the economy. But to the people who live there, what they see is desertification of the soil. So they don't have agricultural land anymore because of the toxins that come off there, heightened water usage, and then obviously a landscape which isn't looking so good. And land was even being expropriated by big energy companies, and the state have ordered them many years after the fact to give it back. But these are the things that I don't think would ever show up in the way we currently focus on ESG. Instead, we go, right, here are all of the solutions, tick, 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 that equals good. But there are so many social impacts in there that won't get picked up because we're too busy focused on diversity and inclusion in boards, which is always going to have a place, but it's so narrow that it doesn't pick up the impacts on the people who are actually going to be impacted by this stuff. And so we need to start thinking civilizationally, locally, that it's not just about global markets and global supply chains, because I think that's ultimately why people keep on turning up to voting booths, or why people get so cynical about this stuff, because they just think it is being created by out of touch people. I don't know what you think of any of that as someone who is so embedded within the ESG sustainability policy world.
I think you all touched on exactly the right points, and another piece or issues on a piece in the puzzle, but a big piece, because that's why I deliberately also mentioned the consumer element, us as citizens, civil society, and ultimately then the consumer links to it, and ultimately the challenges we see. May they be retail investors, may they be consumers on the street, the same applies. There's a lack of awareness, and that's not self-inflicted in most parts. There's a lack of education and capacity building. There's just simply advocacy, but also maybe not in the right places, in the right time, in the right context. So we need to absolutely, as part of the stakeholder prism, we need to look at how can we build awareness, understanding for the issues, How do we take away the fear when the petrol prices go up? And what does that mean if we have to transition towards electric vehicles? And are they actually the end solution? Question mark. This is really, again, part of this wider conundrum of many different systemic issues. And again, the language we speak, the way we address wider society, it conveys an elitist message, which we absolutely must review. And literally that challenge needs to be addressed from policymakers, educators, from ultimately also business, the way we deal with consumers. And we have seen a lot of good and more simplified messages out there. We maybe need to talk more about the impacts and the role that everyone has in society. That is, again, John, that's a transformational shift. That's why, in 2 words here, I would not describe ESG as a transition trajectory. When I talk about ESG, I talk about transformation trajectories. And again, we haven't gotten to the bottom of the issues. How will we be able to resolve all the problems? That is one of the key conundrums. We talked exactly the first half, more, 2/3 of today's conversation around the business and investment specific areas of focus. I think we should have talked probably the other way around, 2/3 on what are the issues that we need to address and tackle in society, and that we can then manage upwards, as we would say in the business context, to bring them to our policymakers and decision makers, to then in turn bring them to business, and from there onwards back into the investment world. It is a cycle. It is, again, a value chain. The question is, do we start it bottom up or top down? And probably we don't have a choice anymore. We have to focus more on bottom up. But that's exactly what needs to be addressed now.
Martina, there's much I would want to say in response to that, but I appreciate we're going to be coming up against your very busy schedule. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I like that you're thinking about getting to the bottom up stuff. I think that's important. And I hope that we can speak again in future. Before I let you go, why don't you tell all the listeners, the viewers, where they can find you and follow what it is that you do?
Great pleasure. I mean, I hope the followers will be as diversified as the stakeholder prism that we discussed today. People can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also currently the chair of the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance. I'm trying to bring data closer to our industry, but also to the public audiences and to the policymakers and regulators to tackle these challenges alongside the stakeholder prism. So you can also find me by looking at Foster. And otherwise, I strongly believe in education and training to solve a part of the riddle, as we discussed today. I'm a guest lecturer and visiting fellow at Henley Business School and University of Zurich. So just look up some of their programs on ESG. Try to get yourself informed and engaged. Sign up and contact me over there too.
Martina, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on again, and we'll speak again, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Likewise. See you soon, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and joining me on this journey.